Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we are coming to you during the strike, and so I am not going to be covering anything that's made or has been made by the struck studios, but it turns out there's actually a whole bunch of other great media out there that we geeks love and want to talk about. Today we're talking about Discworld, the Terry Pratchett series of books that I believe goes to 44 novels, that is very... It's kind of hard to describe, and that's why we're doing a whole podcast about it. We're actually probably going to do multiple podcasts about Discworld, and today we're kind of do an introduction to Discworld and focus on the Night Watch series of books. Whether you've read these or have no idea what I'm talking about, I think there's going to be a lot here for you to enjoy. Don't worry about it. All that and more with myself and Rob McKenzie right after this commercial break that I really hope is not from any of the struck companies. 41. Welcome back. This is Matthew, your host. I'm joined by frequent guest on both this and the Star Wars podcast, Rob McKenzie, who is waving, which you can't see because this is radio. But Rob, how are you doing? And what is Discworld?
Doing pretty well. Discworld is a series of fantasy satire novels which sounds like not a big deal. But Terry Pratchett is one of a very small number of people who has been knighted just for being a writer. Until he passed away, he was the greatest living fantasy author. You said 44. There's some dispute in that. There's 41 main Discworld books, but there's also a bunch of subsidiary. I've got the Streets of Discworld upstairs. I've got a handful of other random ones. There's been board games and movies and a television show, an Amazon show that we don't talk about because it's atrocious. Do not watch The Watch on Amazon. It's the worst. But the series covers a humongous scope of stuff. Terry Pratchett wanted to just have kind of a play space for being able to put whatever fantasy stuff he wanted in a big junk drawer. And so he stole the concept of the Discworld from history of a flat Earth carried on the back of elephants on the back of a giant turtle. And then he decided that continuity was for suckers. And so, like, the timelines literally do not work in his books. It is actually impossible for the time to all work out. And then because he was so tired of people telling him, well, you broke your own continuity and the timelines don't work out, he wrote the history monks into Discworld. And the fact that history was shattered, the monks put it back together in order to cover up for the fact that time doesn't make any, like, continuity doesn't make any sense. Because he just didn't want to deal with people.
And I think that's important, especially as we're doing introduction, because that's why we're not starting with Discworld Book 1, because there really isn't such a thing. The Color of Magic was the first Discworld book published, but as you said, it is very accessible in that if you jump in the middle of a series, you might have a little bit of difficulty, but even then it's pretty simple. But most of the series they're intertwined in that they're constantly making references to things, and so the more you know, but they're all kind of standalone. Like in some ways, as I watch like the MCU and DC and Star Wars try to do these interconnected universes or multi-universes, I think Terry Pratchett in some way is a pretty good one to look for, in part because, as you said, they're not trying to do continuity in the slightest, and in a lot of for those who have heard me rant about time travel, that's one thing I really like, because they're not trying to make it all make logical sense. That's kind of his point.
Right. Well, and the world has its own kind of internal logic to it, but he's willing to retcon whatever at a different time. He's willing to make things like disappear that he wrote about, that he line item into a book, and then they just don't come up and they get moved to somewhere else. He refused to draw a map for a long time. He refused to have a map. Like, that's the classic thing in a fantasy book. You open it up and there's a map inside the front cover, right? And he just wouldn't do it. He would have like drawings of the Discworld and he'd talk about the geography, but he was like, look, that's going to restrict me. And also he would have a drawing of the Discworld with the line, you can't map an imagination. And then people got deeply into it and we're like, but we really want to know kind of where all these things are geographically relative to each other. And so then he finally gave up and made a map, so one of the things that in Babylon 5 was commented was like they never gave speeds for the movement of ships, right?
Right.
Because then that would lock them in to to whatever. But the trade-off in some things is if you explicitly map things out, that gives you ideas for continuity for stories, right? Because if you know that these countries are neighbors, then you can have interactions with them as neighbors, and that does lock you in, but that's fine. That gives you a point of continuous tension, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's one of the things that's really appealing about the books, especially because, and granted, as we've discussed before, I am not as big a fantasy person as you and some others who are in our friend group and have been on this podcast, and there are some fantasy works, especially some of the stuff by Brandon Sanderson, that I find very inaccessible because it's completely about a world for which I have no reference points.
Yes.
And one of the things that I really love about Discworld, and I think this is part of what puts it into the sort of parody, satire, humorousness of it, is that on the one hand, this seems to be a kind of medieval world, and that, that it is about like truncheons, or at the very early days of gunpowder in terms of like, whether guns do or don't exist. And that is a plot line actually of one of the Night Watch books. People want a king, there are dragons, and it's a lot of the things that are signposts of the medieval world, the fantasy adventure world. And, there's no electricity for the most part, things like that. There's magic. And yet into that world, then he puts an awful lot of modernness, Yes. And so, for example, every time there is a big public gathering in the streets of Ankh-Morpork, which is one of the big cities and where most of the stories, at least a lot of the stories that I've dealt with, take place, you'll have a guy basically who's, a modern-day vendor, like, walking around with his cart selling stuff. And that's probably not the best example because I think you did have those for a couple hundred years ago, but like there's just, there are the equivalent of organizers, if you think about like early BlackBerry type things that are just, they have a little demon inside them instead of like electronics. And there's all kinds of stuff like that in terms of the way they get paid and things like that. They're basically using magic or fantasy to put the things that are in our own world back into the medieval world.
Well, yeah, and what he's doing is he's using the fantasy setting to provide some like distance in your head, right? Of like of the stuff that you do that seems absolutely normal to you. What happens when you transpose it onto a world where people behave like people, right? They make self-interested decisions, they do the things that they do, and you transpose in something like the world getting smaller, right? One of the big themes in later Watch books is, and in specifically in Going Postal, which is the first Moist Van Lippig book, is the clacks system, which is a real thing from the United Kingdom. Before telegraphs, before electricity, they had semaphore towers that they used to send information around, and he uses that as the world is getting smaller. Right, electronic communications make us able to send information back and forth from here to Hawaii to China to Africa to anywhere instantly. I can send an email like I did today at work. I communicated with somebody from my company's home base in Germany, right, multiple times instantly. It's zero hesitation. Whereas sending a message to Germany, in the year 1600 would take weeks, right, at the minimum, and so. You have this tightening of the world and the world getting smaller and broader, and you getting to see and touch more people, and so it's harder for bad things or good things or anything that is far away to feel far away.
Right.
And so the books will struggle with that kind of perspective of like, why does it matter to us, like on a day-to-day basis, what's happening in Europe? Right. But nowadays it matters a lot, right? If there's some crazy dictator who starts a war in the middle of Europe, well, that impacts the whole world for as long as that war is going on, and from then on out, right?
Definitely. Yeah, it's a really fun thing that the books do in terms of using kind of pseudo technology and stuff to make it accessible, but also still put it pretty far back in the past. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of people, like, especially if you pick up a book or you read some of the passages, a lot of it is humor. Yes. And a lot of it, I think, can appear silly is the wrong word, but I think, kind of not fluff, I think, is a good word. That I think
Right.
it is often perceived to be like, oh, someone is just having fun with this universe. They're making things up. These are good for like a summer read or, getting yourself to laugh a little bit.
And they are. They're light books. Like,
very much so. Very much. Yeah. There's no more. I don't think you're ever going to cry over, what happens to a character or feel like deep emotional moved.
I disagree.
But well, okay. Well,
they're light in terms of like they're short. The writing is easily accessible, and the characters and everything feels engaging, as opposed to like some doorstop fantasy novel like we've talked about in the past, right?
Right. Okay. So that's a bad example. But the point that I'm gathering to though is that. So the first question might be, why are we talking about it on a podcast called Superhero Ethics? And I know the answer, but I want to throw this to you. To those who think like these books are fluff, but that's kind of all they are, what's your response?
Terry Pratchett wrestled with the things that make us human. And he passed these things through a lens of fantasy and a lens of satire. But fantasy and satire have always historically been a way to address big problems by abstracting them. Right.
Yeah.
Great satire authors of the past would set things in weird or strange places to make commentary on the things of their day. If you look at famous satirists of the past, Jonathan Swift, Voltaire, they wrote fantasy pieces. Right.
Yeah.
Candide, a Visit from Sirius from Voltaire, almost anything by Jonathan Swift. They were pieces that were set outside of what was normal in order to provide a different lens on issues that were going on. And Terry Pratchett does this specifically. He wants to talk about economics. He wants to talk about slavery. He wants to talk about the rights of people. He wants to talk about the experiences of those who have different views. He wants to talk about issues about being trans, about having problems fitting into other societies or those societies letting you fit into them. He wants to talk about slavery. He wants to talk about everything. And he'll take a book and he will be very bald-faced about what he's doing in a given book, right? He's like, I'm coming at you with a hammer. We're going to talk about slavery this book. Feet of Clay. Let's go, right? But at the same time, like you said, it's funny. In Men-at-Arms, which is fundamentally a book about, and we want to specifically talk about Guards books. So we're talking about like the second and third Guards books, Men-at-Arms and Feet of Clay, and then probably Jingo too, the fourth one. In Men-at-Arms, there's a very very, very funny exchange with Vimes and Carrot, where Vimes mentions, the king is the head honcho, and Carrot goes, or the queen, and he goes, okay, fine. A Hauncherina, and he goes, no. I think it would be Honchessa, and like Carrot thinks through all the different like versions of like female. He's like, no, that would be a young girl. Like it's Hauncherina, so it like, and if I'm just like, everybody does this in Ankh-Morpork, and I don't understand why, and it makes like, what is wrong with the people in the city? No, Vimes has lived in the city his whole life, and he's never left it.
Yeah, I think it's one of the best things that he writes into the books is he kind of makes this joke through the eyes of Vimes, who's the leader of the Night Watch and then of the City Guard by the as things move on, and that's a whole very confusing thing I'm going to paint with broad strokes here. But he's a point of view character for a lot of the books, and he makes this comment about how he's always annoyed by the fact that the people of the city seem genetically disposed, in his words, to go off on tangents, which allows the author to go off on tangents all the time.
Yep.
And we'll get to the Night Watch, but I just want to focus more on this kind of overall thing, because I think it is, the whole idea of this podcast is to look at the way that the stories that, often appear as less serious, superheroes and comic books and all these kind of things. And I think that idea that they're less serious is in and of itself deeply flawed, but that often they have, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, very deep social meaning and very deep social commentary.
Yes.
And Pratchett, I think, is one who is very explicitly trying to make that commentary. And as you said, like on one hand I want to say, but it's hidden under all the comedy and fluff. It's not. It's not hidden at all. It's very unsubtle at times. But it is so wrapped up in comedy and humor that I feel like that the kind of person who's like, oh, I don't want politics in my world, is going to very happily read them.
Yes.
And probably internalize some of the messages. I mean, in terms of like finding that subtle line of teaching people about social justice without letting them know you're teaching them, I think Pratchett's one of the best of all times.
He's very, very good. He's actually so subtle at it that there are a number of people who have tried to co-opt his works as things that he explicitly didn't stand for. And like his daughter, Rhiannon Pratchett, has had to come in and be like, are you insane? Like, there are people who are like, Terry Pratchett would be against trans rights. And she's like, have you read Monstrous Regiment? Have you interacted with any of the characters in the Guards books? Like he'll be imperfect is the other thing, is because he wrote books. The first book was published in 1983 and he published them all the way up through 2018, I think. And right. So the thing is that some of his views shifted over time. Right.
Yeah.
But he always tried. And so that he'd always have a dialogue and people would come back and be like, I don't like the stuff that you did in this book, or the way that you phrase things, or the way that you address stuff. And he'd go, okay, I'll be better. And then his next book sometimes he would come back and explicitly hammer something that he had touched in an earlier book. I think that actually Monstrous Regiment, which is the 31st book, goes back and re-hits trans issues in a way that he tried to touch in Men at Arms much more aggressively and directly.
Yeah.
And that book is wild. A Monstrous Regiment is – there are very few people who present as the gender that they were born as in that book. And it's
awesome.
It's very interesting. It's about a bunch of women that sign up to go to war. Like they recruiter comes to town and they all fake being men to sign up into this regiment.
Yeah.
And the sergeant leads them through everything. And how spoilery do we want to be? Because this book has
spoilers are fine. Yeah.
Some spoilers are fine. The sergeant leads them through war and figures everything out, and the protagonist, the viewpoint character for the whole book, somebody figures everything out and throws a bundle of socks over the bathroom stall and is like, you should pack with these, right? Because people are going to look and see that you don't got anything down there.
Yeah.
And so the character does this, and then they gradually figure out that almost every person in the regiment except for the lieutenant is born female, right? And the sergeant, they find out much later, also is born female and has been presenting as a male for so long that everyone, including them, considers them a male.
Right.
And then, it's an interesting point of like, how do people want to present themselves, right?
Right.
And it is a whole book of that, of like they do this big scene where the sergeant like points out all of the officers when they finally meet all the officers, the big general staff. It's like, these people stay in the room, those people go out. And right. Everybody's like, why are you dividing up these people entirely randomly and arbitrary? And they close the door, and the sergeant's like, all right, all y'all are ones that I sussed out as fake, like as presenting male but having been born female. Every single one of you. There's half of the general staff. Like, yeah. You can't put these you can't call these soldiers women, and then you were the ones prosecuting this because they were too out as they want to present as women in addition to have been born a woman. So it's a great, like, he wants to address this issue better because it runs underneath all of these. And then people are like, oh, there's no politics in this. And I'm like, he's angry. He's actively angry that people are being to people for being trans and wanting to choose their own gender presentation, no matter what it is, no matter how they started. How did you miss this?
Yeah, I think that's so true. I would probably describe it as that they were assigned female at birth. I read the book itself. But and that and even to go to the Men at Arms book that you mentioned, that's one that's written much earlier. And in that one, it's not as much that it's specifically about a character who I think we would today say is trans, but one of the main characters is a dwarf. Yep. And the dwarf has a long beard. And so to everyone else, they just assume this dwarf is male. And it is revealed at some point.
The dwarves actually don't have any public gender presentation except male for every dwarf, even within their society. Yeah.
But it ends eventually, I don't want to get too lost in the weeds of the details of it, but the what it gets you to is an idea of that the way we humans perceive gender, and I would say actually, Euro-Americans perceive gender, because a lot of other cultures are very different, the dwarf doesn't fit. And the dwarf culture has a fundamentally different understanding of gender. And and I thought it was, I think he was definitely pushing the bounds at the time.
Yes.
He was doing it as a cisgender person in the 80s or 90s. And to me, his reaction when some people did push back is the best I think you could imagine, where he'd be like, oh, okay, that's awesome. Tell me more. He didn't get defensive, as far as I understand, from and this is from lots of, I've read interviews with activists who would talk to him. He would just be like, oh, okay, I want to learn more, and then I want to put that into my books.
Yes.
And here I think is where the lack of a locked-in... Here's where I think the lack of a locked-in continuity really helps him, because I think one of the things that we're seeing with Marvel and with Star Wars and with DC and with some of these other properties is that they are locked into some degree of continuity, and they're often trying to make modern versions of characters that were written almost entirely by cishet white men in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Maybe we're Jewish, and that often gives a somewhat different perspective. But, and I think some of them have wrestled with that really well. For example, actually, no, I don't want to mention... I was going to mention a particular TV show, but part of the strike, I don't want to get into those, so I'm not going to mention it. But I think some of them have been done well, some of them haven't. But the point being that they're wrestling with it in a way that Terry Pratchett is just like, I don't need to wrestle with it because I can just change it,
Right. Well, and part of that is actually because Terry Pratchett has never let anybody else write in Discworld, right? There's nobody else. Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett were very, very good friends. They collaborated together on Good Omens, which is one of the best pieces of fantasy type writing in this space. And Terry Pratchett wouldn't let Neil Gaiman touch Discworld, and Neil Gaiman doesn't want to touch Discworld, right? Yeah. And so there's no shared universe problem, which is a problem in these big properties, which is they're so big that one person can't manage them all. Right. And so you have you don't have a single unified creative vision, and you don't have one person who can go back and say, well, I want to go and rewrite my own history and I want to retcon whatever. And I don't feel beholden to anybody else. Right. Right. And so, and we fight against people like that on these big shared properties. Star Wars, as soon as it turned into a big shared property, in the 90s, when the EU came in, the expanded universe, we had it fundamentally didn't matter to George Lucas. Now we can say whatever we want about George Lucas as a creator, but he felt like Star Wars was his creation to do whatever he wanted in the same way. But then once it got too big for him, once there were other properties, it's a shared universe, and it's really hard to let other people play in the sandbox when they might have a different view on things. They might not handle things in the same way. They might not handle things as sensitively, or they might handle things more sensitively and blow you away. Right. Right. So they want, and to play in a shared universe sandbox, you need a lot more structure. Right. Yeah. You need a guidebook for exactly how this character behaves, because as soon as you hand that character off to somebody else, you want them to be consistent in the next property. Right. Right. And I think that's a good point. I think that's part of why in a lot of the fandoms now we have people fighting with wildly different visions of what we think the original author intended or meant. And I certainly don't think that all of those views are equal by any means, but that's a topic you've heard me talk about at great length in the past. And so getting back to Pratchett, let's talk more about some of the specific issues that he does want to talk about in these books. And I think there are some books that are very specifically where one individual book or a series of books is about a particular thing. For example, he wrote one book that we're going to talk about a bit that is very much a anti-war book that I believe was written or came out around the time of the original Desert Storm. And very much kind of a protest about that. I'm not sure if that's exactly true. It might be, earlier in regard to the Falklands or something like that. It was published in 1997. So
okay, so it was after the original Gulf War, but while both Britain and the United States still were continuing, warfare, and there was still a lot of it's called Jingo, and there was certainly a lot of jingoism coming out of both England and the United States, and we'll get to that. But there were, I think, some real overarching themes to Terry Pratchett's work in Discworld. And I think one of them is best exemplified by something you've been telling me about, Grandma's definition of sin. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Granny Weatherwax is... I would argue that Granny Weatherwax is Terry Pratchett's favorite character. She's angry, which is the description that I've best heard describe Terry Pratchett. He is righteously angry all the time. And that's the way that she operates. And she defines sin. There's a section in Carpe Jugulum where she says, and that's what your holy men discuss, is it? And the priest that she's talking to says, not usually. There's a very interesting debate raging at the moment on the nature of sin, for example. And she says, and what do they think? Against it, are they? He goes, it's not as simple as that. It's not a black and white issue. There's so many shades of gray. She goes, nope. Pardon? There's no grays. Only white that's got grubby. I'm surprised you don't know that. And sin, young man, is when you treat people like things, including yourself. That's what sin is. He says it's a lot more complicated than that. No, it ain't. When people say things are a lot more complicated than that, they means they're getting worried that they won't like the truth. People as things, and that's where it starts. Oh, I'm sure there are worse crimes, but they starts with thinking about people as things.
Yeah. And I love that because it is such a simple, easy explanation of a school of ethical thought that goes back, I think there are Greek I believe there are far earlier, like maybe Greek or Roman or other philosophers who've come up with similar ideas. Mm-hmm. To me, though, what it rings closest to is Martin Buber, who was a Jewish theologian, German in the 19th century, who wrote I, thou versus I, it. And the idea being that, like, a good relationship is when I see you as thou, as the other, an other person that I relate to, versus that when I start seeing other people as it, as things. This is the person who sells me my groceries. All I know is the way that they interact comes into my life. He wrote, an entire book on this and many, many books on it, and people have written, libraries about these theological ideas and philosophical ideas. And Grandma Weatherwax,
Granny Weatherwax, yeah.
Granny Weatherwax comes up with the whole idea in just a few sentences.
Yes.
Treat people as people, not as things.
Yes. And that's kind of the big arc of all of the Night Watch books, because one of the things about the Night Watch books is they're about Vimes running a growing police force, right? Mm-hmm. And they're growing because Ankh-Morpork has opened its doors to the peoples of the world. Lord Vetinari has decided that anybody can move to Ankh-Morpork. He's not going to discriminate. They have money. He likes money, right? Mm-hmm. And what that means is that everyone does move to Ankh-Morpork. Dwarves and trolls hate each other. There are gnomes, which are very tiny. There are gargoyles, which are kind of a species of troll that live on the tops of buildings. There's vampires and werewolves and ghouls and banshees that all move to Ankh-Morpork. And one of the big things is, well, if you have a civic group that is public facing, you got to hire people, like we would call them diversity hires or affirmative action hires now. But in reality, like the Night Watch is just this big melting pot of all these different people, right? Yeah. And they have to struggle over and over again with what is their definition of a person.
Right.
And they start by folding in trolls and dwarves and a werewolf, right? A troll, a dwarf, and a werewolf are the diversity hires at the very minimal Night Watch. And by the end they're running into, so they've hired a golem. Well, golems aren't alive, are they? Mm-hmm. And then later on, they have to deal with the fact that there are goblins that everyone hates and orcs that everyone hates. What about the villain races, right? You can deal with dwarves. Like if you're in a fantasy setting, everybody wants to play a dwarf. But like all these evil species, right? Are they people too? And of course, through the course of the books, it turns out like an undead zombie winds up joining in.
Oh yeah, there are vampires that play a part in the city, and
they do hire a vampire to the Watch eventually, even though Vimes hates it. He hates it to death.
Yeah.
He's so against it. But finally enough pressure gets put on him where he's like, fine, we'll probationarily hire this vampire. When they do something, when they do anything to screw up, I will kick them out. So they can't make any mistakes, which is a very, very much a thing for diversity hiring in workplaces. You have to be better, right?
Yeah.
Women have to be significantly better than men in a lot of hiring situations. And that's deeply unfair.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I want to touch more on that in a minute, but I wanted to pull back first to this idea of treating people as things, because he, like Boober, he definitely means like when you actually see other sentient beings and you don't see them as people.
Mm-hmm.
But he also means it in a much more expansive way, like Boober does, and like others of the school of thought, where part of the idea is it's also talking about, if you see people if you see like lower classes as just there to, die for you or to buy your stuff or to, somehow advance your agenda because you see them as lesser than you are. It's basically the idea of if you see a person only through the lens of how they are valuable to you, that's when you've crossed this line into seeing them as a thing. Instead of seeing their full, I want to say humanity, but that's the whole point. It's not just humans. Their full personhood, their full sentienceness, or whatever it is.
Yeah. And so there's a bit in Feet of Clay where the whole book is kicked off by deaths of some fairly unregarded people, right? Mm-hmm. And it's an old priest that nobody really cares about and a guy that runs a museum for dwarf bread. And then later on, they discover that 2 more people died as a consequence of some poisoning from the same source. And these people are just like, she takes in mending and does seamstress mending, and and her grandkid died as a result. And then Carrot goes and he tells one of the villains, he's like, these people died. And he goes, well, were they important? And Carrot goes, I almost felt sorry for you up to that point. I really, like, you got dragged into the situation. You didn't have total control over it. Kind of ran you over. And I almost felt sorry for you.
Yeah.
And he goes, I'm glad that Commander Vimes didn't get to hear this because Vimes will not stand for that. And that's his overriding thing is Vimes is a very weird aspect because he's basically the avatar of law, right? He wants law and order, but not law and order in the sense that most laws are shaped by society, by people with power. Yeah. He hates people with power.
I would even say that he's an avatar of justice rather than law, in that he sees the law often as things that are created by people in power, and that when the people in power want him, one of the constant tensions of the book is that he very rarely is willing to be the enforcer of the government, and to the point where the patrician, who's the person who rules the city, and he's a great character in of himself. Yes. He has learned that the best way to get Vimes to do something is to order him not to do it.
Oh, yes, for sure.
Which has become just a wonderful ongoing theme throughout the books. Yeah,
he tells Vimes, you always used to have an anti-authoritarian streak. And it's very interesting that you've kept that despite becoming an authority. Yeah. It's very zen of you. And Vimes goes, sir. Not a question. Not like just I acknowledge what you're saying.
Yeah. And I think that's a great way to jump into. Let's start talking about the Night Watch books themselves, because they're a very interesting set of books. And as you said, they grow expansive as the books go on, in part because the group that they're about expansive, because it's originally about the Night Watch, who are the people who literally are just supposed to like walk around the city and ring their bell and say all is well, or ring their bell if there's a problem, and they're mostly ignored.
Yes, they're the dregs, right?
Exactly. And one of the things that and Vimes is left in control when his higher up, the person who trained him and he really sees as a mentor and almost a father figure, dies, and no one goes to the funeral except other guards. And he kind of like gets it in his mind that he should start thinking more about what matters and that the guards can do things, and winds up surprising the city when all of a sudden they're actually trying to like solve crimes and prevent bad things from happening and punish when figure out what happened when bad things did happen. And the city kind of doesn't know what to do with him because they're not used to someone actually caring, especially if it's the rich and powerful who do bad things.
Right. And Vetinari, the patrician, has set up the city so that the watch is an appendix. It's going to get stood down at the end of Men-at-Arms because it doesn't do anything. The way that you prevent crime, Vetinari says that if we're going to have crime, and we will, it should be organized.
Yeah.
and so there's a Thieves Guild, right? And so what the Thieves Guild have is a license given by the city, given by the government that they pay for, that allows them to steal from people. And what they do is they say, well, it's a lot of work to go and steal from people, though. So they go to businesses and they go, here's the deal: you buy a license you buy a Thieves Guild protection from us, and you put it up as a sign, and then we don't steal from you. You pay up with the Thieves Guild every year, and there will be no licensed thievery. If there's unlicensed thievery, give us a call, and we take a very dim view of scabs.
Right.
And by a very dim view, they are brutally lethal at removing thieves. And so theft isn't something the Watch cares about, right? The answer is you turn them over to the Thieves Guild and let them sort it out. You know what? Right. You don't really have street crime when you have people that enforce it. They've created a watch, incidentally, via basically an insurance structure. Mm-hmm. And so the Watch is basically there for murders and to keep the peace, which is a very nebulous term.
Right. And yeah, I mean, when he starts trying to get the Watch to do more, the first people he has to convince is the other Watch people. And then it kind of mushrooms, and he takes over the Day Watch. First, there's a rivalry there. They're just the Watch in general now, and more guards come in. And that's a good place to start. What I think is kind of one of the most interesting questions about the Night Watch is, and again, these are books that start getting written in the 1980s. I think a lot of the Night Watch books specifically are written in the 90s and early 2000s. Mm-hmm. And he dies in, as you said, the late 2000 teens. BLM was, I think, just getting started at the time he passes away. ACAB was not a phrase that was being used, but is being used obviously much more today. Although certainly, concerns about police brutality were a thing in most of his books. Here's the way I think that some people today would be like, oh, I don't want to read any books about police because of ACAB. And I think that's a very fair perspective, and I'm not trying to push anyone out of it. I would say that with these books, there's two things going on. I'm curious if you would agree. One is that, that I think one of the big problems that many of us would have with police is that I think the distillation of it is that the police are there to enforce not justice, but the law. And the law is handed down through these oligarchical, the rich are basically in control kind of political systems that most of us live under, to just with varying amounts of how expressly oppressive it is. But, I think even in this country, we see that all the time with the police. There's an extent to which in the Night Watch world, that's not the case. They want it to be. And let me just say both of these things and then...
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just letting you know that I have stuff. Yep.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that it certainly is to some extent, and that over the course of the books, Vimes is trying to get out from under that idea and make it into something very different. Because it's not police as it is in our world, it's the Watch. But the second part of it is that I think that if Pratchett had lived another 10 years and people had gone to him and said, hey, we're thinking a lot more about police brutality, and we're thinking a lot more about the idea that police fundamentally as an institution are problematic, and all the ideas of ACAB, I think Pratchett would have responded in exactly the way he did with the other stuff and been like, yeah, you're probably right. Let me see how I can write this in different ways or be more aware of that or whatever it is.
Yeah, I agree. But you also have to take it from the perspective of Terry Pratchett is from the UK. He's a British author. Right. And so he is going to write about the way that policing is handled in Britain. And they actually have a thing, Peel's Principles of Policing by consent. Most of them don't carry guns, and the policing is there. They've set up this set of principles. Peel set up these set of principles of, like, police are there to serve the people. right? The public.
Right.
They keep the peace. And so when you compare the way that policing is done in the UK to the way it's done in the United States, it's very different. We have a militarized police system, and they oftentimes will treat the public as their enemies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that having an aspirational group, how you want it to be, is good, right? Because that forces people to confront how they're different. Like you could call it in the United States, like there are very funny police shows, right?
Yeah.
Brooklyn Nine-Nine is a show that is about a fictional police department, and it is very funny, right? Mm-hmm. But it is fundamentally about a different thing than The Watch, because American policing is very different than British policing, right? And so he probably would have had a book where he has police from a different place that behave very differently towards their people, and like compare and contrast it and say, look, yes, I agree, the cops there are bastards, right? Yeah. Like you should probably be better. And
to be clear, I do think it's worth pointing out there is quite a lot of police brutality and racism in the British policing system. It is very different, I think, in much less ways. And unlike here, where policing was literally born out of slave catching, like England has a very different history with it.
Yes.
So I just want to be careful that we're not romanticizing the UK police system too much.
I'm not. I'm just drawing the lens that like his view of policing is based on a completely different philosophy of policing than the United States policing. Like you're saying, it came from entirely different starts and places, and they're converging a little bit, but not like. I think that just the arming of police, that difference alone, right? That like only 7% of officers in Britain even carry a weapon or carry a gun. They might carry a truncheon or a nightstick or pepper spray or whatever, but 93% of them don't carry any kind of lethal weapon on them. And so when you look at it from that lens of like he's looking at police as they aren't an armed militarized force, like that changes the game, right? Even if the police there are senses, right? They aren't with guns. You don't have to be afraid for your life. You just have to be afraid that they're going to bully you.
Family-friendly podcast.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. We'll just have a lot of beeps right there, but that's fine. I really think you're right, though, and I think that's an important thing. And I think, because I think it's important to understand that he starts from a different place, and like even something like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, I think there's an argument to be made that it is still presenting the idea that American police could be made better. Yes. When I think a lot of us are on the side of it kind of has to be torn down and started over. I think you make good points that in England it is a fairly different thing, and also that's being read right way back in history. And to me, I think I'd start with a place of it comes from a very different place, but also that I want to be very careful. It's not to say that like, oh, we all just discovered racism in the police when Black Lives Matter got started is obviously incorrect. I think it's when a lot more white people started to pay attention to it. Yep. But there's been racism in policing, as we said, since policing started. But I do think that as poor people approached Pratchett, he would have definitely put that more into his books.
Yeah, he certainly would have.
Yeah. So let's talk more about some of the specific characters, because I think that's also where we start to really get into some of the points that he's making through these characters and through these stories. And let's talk about Vimes and Carrot as the two kind of... Because I think they present a very interesting dichotomy between the two of them, and each one of them has a lot of rhetorical power in the way that Terry Pratchett uses them to make points. So tell us a little bit about Vimes and about Carrot.
Yes. So Vimes is, and especially in the first few Watch books, he's a pastiche of hero cops, right? He is Dirty Harry. He's a tough, no nonsense street brawling thug with a heart of gold that is fine with breaking the rules to do the right thing, which is from a structural perspective, this is getting into police problems, right? Because this is saying that the rules bind the police officers and you shouldn't follow them if you're, in hot pursuit, and that gives them a lot of license to do whatever. So that but that's what he does. Carrot, on the other hand, is newcomer to the city, and he's idealistic. He is a simple person, but that doesn't mean stupid, is the line that they use. He moves in straight lines when everyone else moves in circles. And he is the like they make a big deal about it in several books. He is the uncrowned king of Ankh-Morpork, right?
Yeah.
And his girlfriend Angua makes the point. She's a werewolf and she can see it, that he moves through the city like a tiger moves through the jungle, right? He wears it like a skin, and it's his natural environment. That he had this charismatic talent. He was raised by dwarves as an orphan, and so he comes to the city, and he has in a dwarf mine. You only meet 100 people in your whole life, right? All the people living in this mine, all the dwarves there. In the city, you'll meet 1 million. And he has this charismatic talent that expands out to fill the whole city. He knows everybody, and everybody likes him. And nobody likes Vimes. But Vimes is in charge. Vimes is the commander. Vimes is Carrot's boss.
Yeah.
And Carrot is very clear about that. Like, that he's got a boss. And that if his boss tells him no, well, that's it. That's the line. That's the end. Right?
Right.
Because
Carrot, I think one thing that's really important about him, he starts out very much the avatar of law, but not because not because he thinks the nobles are right and have this divine right to set the law. It's because he's never thought about it, and so he just thinks the law is good. Yep. And so on his first day as a member of the Watch, he goes and tries to arrest the entire Thieves Guild.
Yep.
And has to kind of learn that's not how it works.
Yep.
But he translates into this very interesting character. And I want to talk about a couple aspects of him. And the first thing is, I think he often gets to be the avatar for the audience about this idea of expanding our nature of people. Because he is fundamentally good-hearted, but he's fundamentally learned the prejudices of the people he grew up with, not because they're like particularly hateful people, but just because they live in a mine and they don't know much about other people.
Yep.
And so in an interesting scene early in the book that Angua, his eventual girlfriend, is introduced, she is and again, I love that you use the term diversity hire, because I think that's he's not making fun of affirmative action by any means. He's making fun of the people who think affirmative action is just diversity hires.
Yes.
When actually it's people who have different skill sets and different perspectives that are needed. But in that book, they keep saying that Angua is a diversity hire and they start the word with a W and then it gets cut off.
Yes.
And so the joke is that everyone thinks she's a hire because she's a woman. And there's some question as to, did they actually know she was a diversity hire because she was a werewolf, or what it is?
Well, it's spelled out. Vimes knows, but Carrot doesn't.
Right. And most of the rest of the crew doesn't. And so he doesn't know she's a werewolf. He finds out that she's staying in a place that is full of the folks who are genuinely not liked, like werewolves and zombies and vampires and things like this. And he's very worried for her. And you see her like having been kind of into this guy, maybe wanting to flirt with him, but then really kind of like souring on him when she sees he has these prejudices.
Yep.
Except that, like, he is the perfect example of the person who, when presented with new information, will immediately drop his prejudgments. Which prejudices, that's where the word comes from, prejudging.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say but he still snap reacts until he's rewired himself. When he first finds out, when she first changes in the moonlight, he turns around and sees that she's a werewolf, and he draws a sword because he thinks she's the door's closed. She's been in the room with him. She's the only person there, and so but he goes, "Oh, it's a wolf. I should fight. I should be afraid." And he has to rewire himself, but he does by the end of that book. Yeah.
And I think that's what makes – and I think it seems very intentional to me that Carrot is the avatar for those things, because part of what they're saying is that even the best of us, even the most morally pure, utterly innocent, can still have these prejudgments.
Yep.
And and I think the whole point is that Carrot isn't like – it's saying that like – it's okay that Carrot has that first reaction. It's not great, and it's better if you don't. But to have that reaction at first makes sense, given how Carrot is raised. The question then becomes, when you're presented with the evidence, what do you do? Because I think that's the thing that's so frustrating and has been throughout history, is when you start with preconceived notions about another gender or another race or another religion or another, gender identity or any of these things, are you able to say, oh, well, actually, I met this person and they're kind of awesome, so maybe my views about the group that they're from, I should change? Or are you going to say, oh, well, now that I know this about that person, everything I experienced about them must be wrong? Or, oh, well, they're one of the good ones, so they're okay, but everyone else in their group is still bad.
Yeah.
And it's a fantastic allegory about, like, the fundamental basis of prejudice. And it really is, I think, one of the best books, series of books, I think all of Discworld is, about what we do when we confront something that's different. And how do we get past our innate, desire to judge the different as bad or as dangerous or anything like that.
And that judging the different as bad and dangerous, Angua, who's a werewolf, deals with all the time because other watch members know about this. So like when Feet of Clay comes around and she has to deal with the fact that everyone carries a little bit of silver on them.
Yeah.
Except for Carrot. Carrot has decided she's safe, and so she's safe. Like, he couldn't, he's probably the one person who probably could successfully fight her because he's, like, A, she would pull her punches, and B, he's tough as hell. So if he had silver, he would actually be a real threat. And everybody else, even people who are her best friends, who like her and work with her every day, carry a little bit of silver, just in case, on them. Which is and everybody's just a tiny little bit fearful of her, and she senses this all the time. And it is this wild, like, allegory for racial tension that you wouldn't realize if you aren't thinking about it that way, right? It's just like, oh yeah, of course people are going to be tense. She can turn into a wolf and tear out your jugular vein, right? Like, of course you're going to be a little bit afraid. And it's like, yeah, but anybody could do that. Like, so like anybody it could hurt or kill you. Why are you so picky about it being a werewolf, right?
Yeah, I think it's that second point especially, because when people look at like a werewolf or a zombie or like the X-Men as a metaphor for something like racism or anti-religious bias or any of the like, it always falls apart a little bit, because the fundamental thing is that like no one race is actually different in terms of like their aggression or their propensity to violence than any other part of humanity.
Yeah.
Werewolves or X-Men, an X-Men does have the ability to melt me with his laser eyes or something like that. So it's not a perfect analogy, but as you said, I think that part of what he goes to is a werewolf looks scary, but the reality is that any person can attack you with a weapon of any kind or anything like that. You know? Werewolves just happen to have their weapons in their mouth instead of in their hands. Yeah,
in the United States, like, we have more guns than people here, right? So, like, statistically, you will meet people with guns over the course of the day if you go out in public. Just the nature of the United States, right? And are you going to say that, these people are inherently scary or dangerous just because they happen to have access to a lethal weapon? I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that I'm concerned that the lethal weapon's out there, but, like, I think that this is a lesson that, like, I could probably take to heart more. Yeah.
I would actually argue that it is, like, not only just my gut feeling, but I believe the statistics do demonstrate that, because we all have those moments of, I wish I could hit someone right now, but if you don't have a gun with you, it passes. If you have a gun, you often use it. But that's a whole debate not to get into.
But the thing is that you shouldn't just be automatically always afraid of people, I think would be my line, because in the United States it's possible they might have a gun. Concealed carry is legal in many places, right? And so they could just have a gun, and so but you shouldn't by default be afraid of them. Like, I would like fewer guns in the streets. That's a whole different thing. I think that cops shouldn't have guns. I think that we should have fewer guns. But the gun isn't the thing the gun is a tool. It's just a powerful tool. Her jaws are a powerful tool. She has them all the time. Right. Yeah. The person behind it is is the thing that's important, I believe, is Terry Pratchett's point.
Yeah, I think I still disagree with you on the gun part, but I definitely get your main point. I think that's the more important thing there. And just to continue on with Carrot, I think the other thing that he does that is so interesting, and again, it's kind of Pratchett pushing on the way again that we can fall into these mental boxes, is he's the perfect example of the character who, when everyone knows, oh, no one would ever try this harebrained solution to something because we're all too smart to do that. Mm-hmm. He's not too smart to do that, which in many ways often means he's the smartest there, because he's willing to... It's not even that he's not too smart, it's that he has never gone through the thinking that says, oh, why would you do this? And so, plus he has such a magnetic effect on people that there are times when he goes into a huge mob or two mobs that are about to have a street riot and just tells them to go home and be better. And they all do, because they all just, they don't even understand why, but they all want to listen to him. Yeah,
they're like, well, he's earnest about it, right? When they have this discussion where like Nobby and Colin, who are the comic relief guards, are like, so we could go out there. They're about to start a riot. What would Carrot do? And they're like, well, he'd go out there and tell them to shut up and be better people, like you're saying. And they're like, what did that happen to us? And they're like, well, we'd find our heads in the, like, it's separate from our bodies in the gutter. They're not going to stand for this crap. Yeah. And so, because the world is simple to him, right? We could just be better people. You can make this choice, he says. Why wouldn't you make this choice to be a better person? And they're like, because this, ethnic group is my enemy. This other, we're against the species. Trolls and dwarves have always fought. And he's like, yeah, but you don't have to. Like, this is a choice. Yeah. Choose better. Choose different. And like I said, he moves in straight lines where everybody else thinks in a, like, they want to get to this point and they have to go through something else to get there. He just goes directly to the point. Yeah. And it's, he and Vimes are they both will accept largely anyone into the Watch, and they accept people as people for very different reasons. Right? He believes in people. Carrot is idealistic. He believes in people. He believes that you can choose better. You can choose to be good. Vimes is a misanthrope. He believes that everybody is terrible. Right. And so when he gets they're like, well, why are you? What's the quote? There were. Vimes closed his eyes and thought about cigar smoke and flowing drink and laconic voices. There were people who'd steal money from people. Fair enough. That was just theft. But there were people who, with one easy word, would steal the humanity from people. That was something else. Yeah. The point was, well, he didn't like dwarfs and trolls. But he didn't like anyone very much. The point was that he moved in their company every day, and he had a right to dislike them. The point was that no fat idiot had the right to say things like that, because somebody had literally just dismissed the humanity of all the dwarves and trolls that he worked with. It called them technically the same things that Vimes calls them, but Vimes will tell that to them to their face and then work with them. Right? This person won't even go near them. He's a noble person just dismissing them out of hand. Yeah. And I think it's part of why Vimes and Carrot work so well together and why they have so much respect for each other, and why Carrot will always listen to Vimes, even though Vimes is his polar opposite. And Vimes learns that he can use Carrot for things that he could never do or no one else in the Watch could do. Yeah. And one thing I think that I love most about Carrot, and it plays very much into what you're saying there about stealing the humanity, is that because Carrot always sees the humanity in others, the personhood in others, one of the things that happens is he gives people a chance to do better. Yes. And, in shows that are about, cops and criminals or people who are doing bad things, it's almost a trope now, but I think there's some great examples to it. Loki is a great example, but also, in The Wire, you get this a lot of people who sort of say, well, you all expected me to be a villain, so I am a villain. Yeah. And I think that's kind of that's the thing that Carrot subverts, is when Carrot goes to, a bunch of the kind of street kids who are in gangs and are going to get into a big fight and says, let's play soccer instead, or football in their world instead. Yeah. It is satire. It is not meant to be, this is a real thing that could happen, but it is an allegory for what does happen in soccer leagues like that, or, sports leagues or anything where you say, hey, look, the whole rest of the world looks at you as a street kid who's never going to be anything but a criminal and a menace. What if I look at you as someone who could be academic, who could be an athlete? What if I don't look at you through that lens and help you not to look at yourself through it? And that's what Carrot does again and again and again. Yeah, and that's like the whole arc of Feet of Clay. Feet of Clay is about, are golems tools or are they people? Right? Yeah. And Carrot sees exactly that. He sees the golems as people where nobody else does. Let's talk about, because again, this has already gone on for a while, and we've referenced some of the books. Let's talk about two of the specific books as we kind of wrap up, Jingo and Feet of Clay. Let's talk about Feet of Clay first. Give the 30-second version of the plot of Feet of Clay and what it's trying to say. A group of golems want to be free. They want when they say what they want respite. They want the ability to not be a hammer sometimes. Yeah. And so they're treated as tools, and everyone treats them as tools. And
just to back up here, the golems are there are no Jews in this world.
Yes.
But it's very much the Jewish myth of the golem of clay that has been fashioned, and then magic scrolls have been put into the head of the golem, which activate it. But it is basically a robot, but a sentient one.
Yes.
And one that, as we learned, and that's kind of the point, is that it is sentient in a way that its owners and masters don't want to think of it as such.
Yes, and golems must have a master, is one of the rules in their chem, in the words that are placed in their head to activate them. And so they make a master golem, and the master golem starts going mad, and they have to figure the watch has to figure this out and figure out exactly what's going on with a big complicated plot against the patrician and all this. But the big payoff is Carrot buys Dorfel the golem from someone, takes the receipt and places it in Dorfel's head, and the receipt says the bearer of this owns this golem. He takes it and places it with the chem in Dorfel's head. And now Dorfel is free. He owns himself. The bearer of this receipt owns this golem. And the question that they ask over and over is the golem a tool or is it a person? And they say that golem killed someone. And they say that golem cannot be a tool. Tools are not responsible for how they're used. If you hit someone with the head in the head with a hammer, the hammer is not put on trial. If you order a golem to kill someone, the golem should not be destroyed for that. Because the golem can't choose not to do it. And they point this out over and over, that the golems they have a double standard. They look like people, so they're treated like people, except when it's convenient to not treat them like people.
Right.
And so it's a book about treating someone, like Vetinari says near the end, you must destroy the golem Dorfel that, is looking at joining the watch. And Vimes goes, absolutely not. And Vetinari goes, I believe that I gave you an order. And Vimes goes, he thinks he's alive, and that's good enough for me.
Yeah.
And it is such a just like encapsulation of they think this whatever thinks they're alive. They think they're a person. Therefore, we have to treat them as such because we have to trust the internal experiences of people.
And this is, I think, the brilliance of what he's doing in the Discworld novels is this is very clearly a commentary on actual human slavery. Mm-hmm. It's very clearly a commentary on wage slavery and the idea of, the factory owner who sees the people who work for them as just, machines. And I think that's, look at the strike that's happening right now, both with, the actors, the writers, but also the Starbucks, the Amazon strikes, all of those things.
Yep.
It's also a commentary on science fiction.
Yes.
The golem is data being put on trial for is he owned by the Federation or does he own himself? It is every robotic story that you and I have talked about frequently of does AI have its own sentience, and thus does it exist as a person in a society, or is it just a tool?
Yeah. And then the golems show up later because Dorfel makes the point near the end of the book. He's like, you'll hire me as a watchman. And Vimes goes, really? And Dorfel goes, and you'll pay me twice as much as anyone else. I don't sleep. I don't rest. I'm a bargain at double the price. And Vimes goes, well, what do you want to do with money? You don't own clothes. What do you do? Like, if you're going to work all the time, what are you going to do with the money? He goes, I will save up, and I will buy the golem klutz from the pickle factory. And then he and I will save up. And Vimes goes, really? And the line later, the Golem Trust, which is the limited liability corporation the golems make to buy golems, their motto is by our own hand or by no hand. Yeah. Right.
Which is also, if you've ever heard the terms white saviorism or anything like that, the idea that, those of us who are in overclasses can help the people who are fighting oppression. All of us, I think, are oppressed in some ways, but we're looking at something, for example, a white person, I can help the fight against racism, but it's going to need to be led by people of color. And I need to listen to them, what they're taking to do. And it's just such that by our hand alone, I mean, that's been quoted by all sorts of movements throughout history.
Yes.
Saying like, we don't want to be saved by someone else. We need to do the work ourselves, and we want you to help and get the hell out of the way.
Yeah.
But we want, we have to be, or you can't empower, no one can empower someone else,
Yes.
Not in a true sense.
You can't actually give somebody freedom. All you can do is take it away. Right.
Right.
And so you can say, we talk about freeing the slaves. Yes. They were freed, but in reality, there's a way to phrase this, right? Because their freedom is inherent in what they are, right?
Yeah, I think the idea is that like, I can't give someone freedom. I can just stop taking away their freedom.
Yes. Yeah. That's a good way to.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then we can do a hell of a lot to help them as they move.
Right.
But
Yeah.
So that's Feet of Clay. Let's talk about Jingo for a bit, and then we're going to finish up with something that a lot of people who know Discworld and the Night Watch are probably wondering why in the world we haven't talked about, the Vimes economic theory of boots. But let's talk about Jingo for a bit, because Jingo is one of my favorite of the Night Watch books. And it's interesting because I wonder where it fell in, not to get us under the tangent of it, but it's the first time that I wanted to look at a map. And when Googling for maps, I was frustrated because you said there aren't that many. Because I wanted to know where Ankh-Morpork was in regard to this other country called Klatch.
Yes.
And because they wind up having almost a war with it. And the book is all about this. And it is very clearly a commentary on the wars that is happening at that point in Iraq and the generalized wars in the Middle East.
Yes.
And the overall attitude of white people towards Arabs and Muslims. And not that those two things are the same, but it's about Islamophobia. It's about Arabophobia. It's about the fear of difference. And it's about fighting a war over a resource.
Right. So Jingo, there's a circle C. Ankh-Morpork is on one side, Klatch is on the other side, and there's a sea that separates them, and an island raises up in the middle, and then everybody decides to fight over it. It's the plot of the book is basically everybody goes mad for the military, but Ankh-Morpork doesn't have a military. They're an economic superpower. They're not a military superpower. Or they're a superpower. They're just economic power. So they have private regiment raising, and then private regiments go off to Klatch to try to wage war against them. And the book has simultaneously a great ending and so he arrests both armies. He says it's got to be illegal to start a war, and they're like, it actually isn't. And he goes, that can't be true. Let's figure it out. Like, if a war is wrong, it should be illegal. There should be a law bigger than a country's law, which is definitely a commentary on how oversized powers, right, in the world will just ignore the laws of everywhere else, right?
Which was actively happening at the time.
Yeah,
like a lot of the actions that were taken at the time he wrote it, because this was when we were no longer officially at war with Iraq, but we were bombing them from time to time, and certainly things were happening in Palestine and other parts of the Middle East. And the international community, a lot of it was outraged, and there were people saying, like, oh, if only we could arrest Tony Blair and Bill Clinton for international war crimes. And of course, like, but you can't do that. The UN, they're too big for it. And this book is very much a commentary on that.
Yeah, and it's very funny because historically, that wasn't a big deal. Pre-World War I, you started a war and you took some territory, and that was considered legit. And so it's this weird, like, we're projecting our own, like, if you look back, the Crimean War was like that. Like, somebody wanted to take the Crimea, and they did, and they kept it. What the hell?
We wanted to take Texas in the Southwest, so we went to war.
Yeah, exactly. These were just things that happened internationally up pre-20th century. And so it's this, like, projection of our philosophy on national borders into a fantasy world, which is a reflection of pre-20th century technology. So it's just it's just really interesting to think about it.
And it's again interesting how he does the allegories, because, like, for example, the people from Klatch are very clearly meant to be, like I said, representatives of Arab countries.
Yep.
down to a lot of like the insults that like they all wear
Yes.
turbans on their head, and the ethnic slurs that the people there are very, I'm not going to say them, but are very similar to the about the thing they have on their head. And there's some great, again, where Carrot or some of the other Carrot is doing it from a place of innocence. Vimes is doing it from a place of actively wanting to mock people. But what Vimes will do is he will pretend that, and so they'll be like, oh, well, so what's wrong with the people of Clatch? Oh, they do this thing. And he'll be like, don't we do this thing? Well, no, but it's different because this. Well, but don't we do that? And it's really showing just the incredible hypocrisy of all of this.
Yeah.
Similarly, one of the, as you said, one of the things that happens in the book is because the city doesn't have a military, they go back to this ancient time idea where all of the noble houses have to raise their own military.
Yep.
And Vimes is just aghast. Vimes is often kind of the man outside because, like you said, he grew up in the city. He should have all the same prejudices and ideas. He just doesn't. And so he's watching with horrors, the butler that works for his wife, who's very rich, technically works for him. That's a whole other set of stories. He's like, well, I want to go join the military. It's like, why? It's like, well, they all look so smart in their pretty uniforms and things like this. And
the red and white uniform with the gold frogging, right?
Yeah, it's all such beautiful satire of everything about militarism, about nationalism, about jingoism, quite literally. Yeah. One thing I looked is it kind of made me think about the origin of the word jingo, and it's from I think it's the Crimean War. I'm not sure. It might be earlier. But a song that was sung by people who had kind of like were in one of those private armies. And the line of the song is, we don't want to fight, but by jingo, if we do, we've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too. And so it's very much a like, look at how cool and awesome our country is. We wouldn't want to fight, but of course, if we do, we'll win because we're best, which is the very definition of jingoism.
Yeah. And it's definitely, again, from a British lens, right? From a colonialism lens of, we're going to show Johnny Clatchy in what for. We're going to, he'll run at the sight of the cold steel in our hands. And then the question that gets asked is, the Clatchians are an older empire, right? And they're also, like, they've been pacifying their own external, they're an actual empire. They've been militarily pacifying their different sections, their diverse multi-ethnic empire. They've been doing this for a long time. What do you think that they're like? You think that they're going to be threatened by our untrained regiments? What's your plan here?
Yeah, it's just beautifully done, and it points out it's not a. I think it's easy in this kind of case to be like, oh, so I'm going to critique our side by making our side bad and their side good. And like, no, as you said, he arrests both armies. And the resource part of it is, as you said, they're on opposite ends of the Circle C. One of the things that happens is that every 1,000 years or so, this island rises up from out of the sea. And it turns out that it's kind of an Atlantis. It's sunk long ago, but it's under this bubble of gas that every now and then expands enough that it rises up. And so all of a sudden, both of these groups want this resource, and they're claiming that it belongs to them. It's very much supposed to be a stand-in for oil, or the other resources people fight over. But in this case, again, the parody of it, it's completely useless, because we all know it's going to sink back into the ocean pretty soon. But it doesn't matter. They still want to fight over it.
Well, but they don't necessarily know that it's going to sink into the ocean. That's the other thing is Veterinari figures that out. And he's like, cool. We should let them have it. We should get concessions from them, make a deal. And then they pay us, we walk away, and then it goes into the ocean and we win. Like that's his grand plan, right? And everybody else is like, no, we can win a war. And it's also about the waste of war, because they're going to waste more resources on this war than that island could ever give them. Yeah. Right? And it's like a lot of the time war is like that, where you burn more resources than you gain by conquering people, right?
Very much so. Now, there's one last thing I do want to talk about, and then we're going to have a Patreon section. But I want to say quickly, as part of the strike, and you can listen to me talk about this more on the most recent Star Wars episode I put out with Riki Hayashi about the strike. But as part of the strike, one of the things I'm going to do is that 25% of what I take in from Patreon is going to get donated to the fund that's being used to help the people on strike and help all the other people who are affected. So if you ever thought about joining the Patreon, this is a great time. I go into more of it again on that Star Wars podcast, and I'll write about it more in the Patreon. But if y'all want to think about it, it's a great thing to do. But of course, if that's not where you are economically, or if it's not something you're into, that's of course fine too. But we will have a Patreon section where we're going to talk more about some of the other Discworld things. But here, let's finish up with, what is probably my favorite part of in the satirical world, making a very important point that libraries of economists have tried to write, but I think Pratchett captures so perfectly, which is the Samuel Vimes theory of boots, which is that basically it is expensive to be poor. Can you explain what this means?
Yeah. So the quote is, "The reason that the rich were so rich," Vimes reasoned, "was because they managed to spend less money. Take Boots, for example. He earned $38 a month plus allowances. A really good pair of leather boots cost $50. But an affordable pair of boots, which were sort of okay for a season or two, and then leaked like hell when the cardboard gave out, cost about $10. Those were the kind of boots Vimes always bought, and he wore until the soles were so thin that he could tell where he was in Ankh-Morpork on a foggy night by the feel of the cobbles. But the thing was that good boots lasted for years and years. A man who could afford $50 had a pair of boots that'd still be keeping his feet dry in 10 years' time, while a poor man who could only afford cheap boots would have spent $100 on boots in the same time and would still have wet feet."
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is a theory that makes so much sense. It's the idea that when you don't have disposable income and you are spending literally paycheck to paycheck, that means you can't afford better things. And so, go ahead.
I was going to say, not even that. Just look at the cost of the same goods for a poor person or a rich person. If you have money to start and you want to rent a place or own a place, say that your place would have $1,000 of mortgage a month, right, that you want to rent, just for a nice round made-up number. If I'm renting from somebody, they still pay that $1,000 mortgage, and then I pay them, I don't know, a couple $100 on top, call it $1,200, in order to rent the same space that they're paying $1,000 a month for mortgage. It costs me more because I didn't have the money up front for a down payment on the house.
Yep. Plus, they're building up equity in a way that you're not.
Exactly. And so it costs more to be poor. There's 100 different ways. Like the boots thing of buying cheap repeatedly. To me, my favorite example is healthcare in this country. Because if you can afford good insurance, then, there's an insurance cost. But if disaster strikes, you're covered. But more importantly, disaster's a lot less likely to strike because you can afford to go get regular checkups. Right.
Whereas if you're some person who is only going to the emergency room when you're literally on death's door or something like that, often it's because you have, a cancer in your jaw that if you'd been able to see a dentist regularly would have been prevented.
Exactly.
Or any of the other kind of things. There are so many things where if you can pay more money up front, it's going to protect your health, it's going to protect your house, it's going to protect your car. All these things where the system's been set up that it is incredibly expensive to be poor, which means that it's almost impossible to, just save enough to buy a house or save enough to buy a new suit so you can get a better job or save enough to go to school or any of these things.
And this isn't to say that people don't do that, because this is a thing. People save up for these things, but there's a barrier, there's a gradient. It's harder to get out of it than it is to stay out of it.
Right.
Would be my other half. If you start if you start somebody ahead, right, if they have enough money for a down payment on a house, that means that $200 a month, they get to not just build equity, but bank up to do other things. And then so at the end of that, they both have the equity they built in the house and the money that they've saved from that intervening time. And they might have to pay for big house repairs, but here's the secret: they had to do it anyways. All of the things that you have to do in these situations, the situations where you're buying repeatedly crappy shoes, right, instead of one really good pair of shoes that'll last you for a longer time. All of these choices that you have to make it. It's a trap, right? It's a steep gradient to get out, but once you're out, it's really hard to slide back down. It's one directional.
Yeah.
And
I think one of the other points to it is, and this is very clearly stated, Vimes develops this theory because of the time he spends with the rich. And this is in part because, through a hilarious sequence of events, it's detailed in one of the earliest novels, he winds up marrying Lady Sybil, who is the richest woman in the city.
Yes.
And so he spends all his time with the rich. And so part of what he's saying is this theory wouldn't have occurred to him until he spent time with them. And part of where I go with that is, and again, what I'm about to say I think can be used in a very kind of disparaging, oh, the poor are stupid way. That's not what I'm saying in the slightest.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to understand that if you have lived in a situation where no one in your family for generations has been able to do these kind of things, just the idea of maybe I should save money to do something in the future is ridiculous. Because it's not something that anyone you know has ever been able to do. So maybe the chance that you start to get a little bit more wealth and you have the chance to do so, the idea of it probably is hard to even imagine.
Well, and oftentimes you have to pay your way out of a problem, right? You'll have saved up some amount of money. You'll manage to somehow, through some miracle, have banked $1,000 that's sitting when you're poor, and then your car breaks down and you have to pay for it. Well, that wipes you out. And so the idea is saving isn't a thing that lets you get out, right? Because any time that you save up money, it'll get wiped out by something, and you know it, because you can't save enough to get ahead. And
you can't save enough to get ahead, and you don't have enough to get insurance against those things that could go wrong.
Right. And so, like, if you have a nest egg, if you have $10,000 banked, you can ride out all of these problems, right? You can take a dip on the money and save back up to your banked amount. And I'm picking arbitrary, entirely round numbers for all of these. Like, the numbers are different for different places at different times for different people. I'm literally just picking nice round numbers because I know that that's just easier to parse in your head. But and so to some people they'd be like, $10,000 is a whole lot of money to have banked, and other people will be like, oh, that's nothing. Like I'll have a disaster that makes me buy a car, and I'll be like, right, but the line still holds that if you're stuck in the poverty trap, especially, it's very, very difficult to save your way out, to grind your way out, to buy your way out, and it's a mentality too, because you think poor. Because your planning horizon is so short. If you had $1,000 when you're poor, you'll buy yourself a bunch of good things now because it won't last anyways. It'll get wiped out, and it'll get wiped out the next time something happens, regardless.
Yeah, exactly. And again, that's not always true, but it certainly can be true quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I think we're saying the same thing there.
I agree. Yep.
And I guess I would wrap up by just saying I think that's again, it's what is so brilliant about these books, because you and I took this one paragraph, like all the stuff we just said, that's not in the books. And, I'm someone who's like, I don't think Pratchett means to be, and I'm certainly not saying that the result is to be anti-academic. Like, I think Pratchett isn't trying to say, oh, all of economics is stupid because I'm going to make it so simple. Just like he's not saying all of moral thought isn't stupid because listen to what Grandma said. But he's also saying that a lot of that stuff is very inaccessible. And it's like, you could read Das Kapital, or you could read 2 paragraphs from Vimes and at least get the basic idea. You could read Martin Buber, or you could read this one line from Grandma Weathers, whatever, and Weatherwax, and I just love that. I love that he's able to take these incredibly complex ideas and make them much smaller and make them much simpler.
Right, and he's using narrative as a hook because that's something that, like, we think in terms of other people, right? That's kind of how people operate. And so if you don't have a hook or a structure or a way to pass things through, it's really abstract. And like, there's definitely, like you say, a space for really intellectual discussions about things where you are going to sit down and figure out the exact, like, what is the curve where a renter and a buyer, intersect, and what can you do with saving to get there and whatever, and like, what are the monetary theories that get you there? And you can also just say, it's kind of unfair and we should try to fix stuff. Like, just here's the vibe, and he's trying to hook you and get you to the vibe of like being angry that it sucks to be poor, right?
Yeah. And I think that's the real thing, is that he's not trying to tell you how to fix it. He's trying to get you angry about how things are.
Yes.
Because I think that's in many ways, I didn't even thought about this, but here, Vimes and Carrot are the two opposite ends of his spectrum, because Vimes says, I see what you're all doing, I think you're all idiots and I think it's all terrible. Carrot, it says, I'm going to ignore or be ignorant of everything you're doing because I think you should just be doing the right thing.
Yes.
But both of them are fundamentally rejecting all the things that everybody else just takes for granted as, well, we just go to war because that's what we do. Well, we just have these systems because that's what we do. Both of them are fundamentally saying, I see the status quo as wrong.
Yep. And that's the thing with these books is that they reject the status quo. They want there to be change. Yeah. And they think that sometimes you got to get in and shake things up, and sometimes you gotta get your hands dirty and fix stuff. Definitely. And it's just good. Yeah, they're just good. And they say that you can make a difference. That's the other thing that a narrative can really hook you on, is that a person can make a difference. Right. Yeah. Sometimes stuff is big and complicated and hard. The book Night Watch, there's a revolution, and one person can't make a difference except when one person absolutely can. Yeah. Right. And that's the big theme.
It's wonderful. All right. Well, as I said, we'll talk more about Discworld and kind of give some previews of stuff we're going to talk about in the future in the Patreon section. Please do check that out and give some thought to signing up. You also get ad-free content. And again, you're helping to support me and help support the strikers. Although if you also want to donate directly to the strike funds, that's an awesome thing to do as well. But for everybody else who is checking out now, Rob, where can they find more of you?
So I do stuff here. I do stuff with Good Luck High Five. I've actually gotten onto Mastodon recently, which is because I didn't want to be on the Bird site. So I am at kind.social. So if you want to sign up on Mastodon stuff, I'm at Robert on kind.social.
Sweet. And
so you should be able to find me there. I haven't actually posted anything, but I follow a bunch of loading ready run people and stuff. So
nice. I'm still not quite sure where I should go because people who are leaving the Bird app are going in like 4 or 5 different directions, and I can't bring myself to create 5 profiles. But Mastodon, I think, is definitely one thing, and I may well head over there in a bit. But meanwhile, you can still find me on the Bird app, Twitter. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok. Just you search for The Ethical Panda or Ethical Panda. But mostly, the best way to do it is just look in the show notes or go to our website, theethicalpanda.com. You'll find this podcast. You'll find my Star Wars podcast. With both of those podcasts, as I said, throughout the strike or until we get different information from the unions, I'm not going to be making any media about from the struck companies, which are the companies that for whom that makes the contracts with SAG and SAG-AFTRA and the Writers Union, the Actors Union, the Writers Union. But one thing I'm discovering as I think about it is there's a huge amount of media that's not that. I mean, there's books and there's video games, and there's comic books. I'm definitely going to be talking about all of that. I'm going to make an episode on professional wrestling pretty soon. But also, there's an awful lot of TV and movies that are made completely outside that system. You know, BBC and all the stuff coming out of England, anime, Bollywood and the other Indian subcontinent stuff, lots of stuff from Europe, all over the world. People make movies and TV shows that have nothing to do with the SAG system, and let's give some of those some attention. So I'll definitely be looking at some of that. You can sign up for both those podcasts, but most importantly, give us feedback. What do you love about Discworld? Have you never heard of it now, but now you're intrigued? Would love to hear your thoughts, either now or maybe you go back and read one of these books and then give us feedback. Love to hear it. Love to talk about it. We've got a feedback episode coming up soon. I believe it's going to be in 2 weeks. And then I'm going to, because I've just gotten it all that back up, I'm going to do a feedback episode. And then I'm going to get back into making sure that at least every other episode we do feedback. I know I've been terrible about it. I'm going to make it better. So on behalf of myself, Rob, thank you all so much for being a great audience. We have spoken. All right, now for our Patreons. Rob, for someone who hasn't ever gotten their hands around Discworld, has not started it yet, but is thinking that this is a good time to do so, and I think the Night Watch books, they were my entrance. I think that's a great place to start, but what are some others? Give us 2 or 3 other entry points into the Discworld.
So if you want a standalone book, which doesn't really connect to anything else, it like mentioned some other stuff. Small Gods is funny, insightful, does a bunch of stuff, and you don't need to feel like you're missing anything. It doesn't start from anywhere, doesn't go to anywhere. It's just a great standalone book that happens to be set in the world. The Watch as an arc is incredibly good. If you want what I would argue the best piece of like accessible writing that Terry Pratchett's done in Discworld, it might be Hogfather, which is technically the middle of the Death Arc, but it's the high level plot is that the Santa analog, the Hogfather, has vanished, and Death is currently doing Santa's rounds for him. That's the very end. So that means Death isn't doing his job, which means Death's granddaughter is getting hauled in to figure out what the hell is going on with everything.
And Death is a fascinating character, and it's a very different image of Death that, like, I think a lot of great works, including actually, I kind of actually wonder if Neil Gaiman, who created a beautiful image of Death in the Sandman works, I kind of wonder if there's any recording or dialogue of Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett talking about their visions of Death, because they both create very entertaining Death characters who are completely different.
Yes. Terry Pratchett's take on Death is a force, but in the Discworld universe, forces are they are molded by humanity. The way that people see them is the way that things are, and that creates the gods, and that creates these personifications: war, death, famine, pestilence. Right? The four horsemen are personifications of the things that humankind has projected out into the world, and Death is. The line is when you're shaped like a human, you start to think human. And he's bad at it. He takes everything literally, and he adopts a daughter in Mort, and then he gets an apprentice, and then the apprentice marries his adopted daughter, and they have a granddaughter who inherits the powers of Death. She lives a little bit outside time, and Susan Stow-Hewitt is so like. Again, his core characters, Vimes, Granny Weatherwax, Susan, are angry. They're angry a lot. Susan is deeply unhappy that she keeps getting dragged into this death crap. But the Hogfather it's just a great story, and it has, I think, that one of the most impactful things he's written, which is the line that we teach children to believe the little lies, like, the Hogfather, because they have to get prepared to believe the big lies. And she goes, "What do you mean?" And he goes, "Well, mercy, justice, those kinds of things." And she goes,
so brilliant.
It's so brilliant. And she goes, "Wait, no, what do you mean? Those aren't lies." And he goes, "Grind the universe down to its, will you tell me if you find a molecule of mercy, an atom of justice." And she goes, they aren't real. Like they're what humans believe. And she goes, "Yeah, but you have to believe them, or else what's the point?" And he goes, "That's my point exactly." And it is phenomenal. The Hogfather, that speech in Hogfather is it's a punch every time. And it's just a great hook to get, because then you'll go backwards and be like, where did Susan come from? And you'll read some other books back, and then you'll go, well, where's Susan? And you'll read soul music, which is just what happens when you get music in your soul, like to replace your soul. And if something has a soul, it can be killed, right?
And I think it's just one of the great things. I think so. Those are two great entry points. And the other thing I'd say, though, is also if neither one of those grabs you, like, think about the genre of fantasy that you're kind of most into. It may well be there. Like the Grandma Weatherwax, she comes from the Witches series of books. If you really love stories about witches, start with there. Yeah,
the Granny comes from those. There's, if you want something super lighter, there are a handful of young adult ones. Wintersmith, Hatful, or what is it? The first one is Hatful of Sky. Hatful of Sky, Wintersmith, I Shall Wear Midnight, and The Shepherd's Crown are like, if you want something like targeted to a younger audience. This doesn't necessarily mean they're actually that much easier than a normal Discworld book, but they're targeted towards young adults. They're very good, and there's send-ups of different things. Sometimes he'll write pastiches of other pieces of work. So there's a Phantom of the Opera thing in the Witches arc. That is not Carpe Jugulum, the one before Masquerade. Is a mockery of Phantom of the Opera. There's a Faust send-up, which is actually called Faust, and that's crossed out, and Eric is written in instead.
Oh, I love that.
He's very transparent about that. He's like, he read Faust, and he's like, I can do that, but funny. And so there's these direct pastiches of other things. And he gets away from that later, but not entirely.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole bunch of like I think that the three best entries are the guards, the death, and the just standalone small gods.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of places where you can get into it because, like you said, they're mostly they stand alone. You could also read Going Postal, which doesn't technically require you to know anything. Going Postal and Making Money are two books that follow Moist Fun Lipfig, who's a con artist. He's placed in charge of the postal service.
And just so people can find them, what are the first book of the three series we've talked about? So what's the first work for guards, the first work for death, and the first work for the witches?
So the first work for the witches books is Weird Sisters. Or sorry, that's not true. Equal Rights is technically first. But the Equal Rights is just Granny Weatherwax. And then Weird Sisters is about there's a coven that she's a part of.
Right.
So you could read either one of those as your first one, and it's fine. The guards books start with Guards, which has 2 exclamation marks in the title. Mm-hmm. It really kicks off with Men at Arms. Like he never like a lot of these, he writes one book to stand alone, and then like it becomes really interesting in the second book when he expands on it. And the death books technically start with Reaper Man. No, sorry, that's not true. Mort is the first death book. But Reaper Man is gorgeous. Reaper Man has, if he cut the B plot from Reaper Man, it would probably be the best book that he wrote.
Nice.
And that's like, I like Night Watch and Thief of Time are my 2 favorites by him. Reaper Man, like, what hope has the harvest if not for the care of the Reaper Man? What do people have to hope for except that death actually cares about them at the end and like cares about doing a good job harvesting their souls? And the B plot's kind of shaky. It's not one of his best. But Mort is technically the first death book. But a lot of these, because he didn't plan to write this big overarching thing, that it like he would write up just a standalone book that was interesting set in the world. And then it doesn't really matter that much. Like,
yeah. And like, I think that's one of the best parts. Cause like I said, I started with, I don't remember which book I started the Night Watch, but it wasn't either Guards or the Night Watch. I started kind of in the middle, and it was completely accessible. I think if you're the kind of person who wants to read things from the beginning to the end, I think you do gain more in some ways. But really, just if you got a friend who's got any Night Watch, any Discworld book, ask to borrow it, and it can be a good way in. So, have myself, Rob, any of the last comments you want to make before we finish this off entirely?
Treat people as people. People. Yeah, treat people as people.
Yeah.
Like, that's
treat people as people. It's just a fundamentally good idea, and however expansive your idea of people is, and for some it's some animals, for some it's all animals, and I think that's awesome too. But don't, when you interact with other living things, don't just see them only in terms of the value they can bring into their lives, whatever that is. So, on behalf of myself and Rob, thank you so much to our patrons. You're what really makes this possible. Thank you so much. We have spoken.